As mentioned, my name is Roland Ijzermans, which is very hard to pronounce. And I'd like to start this talk with an imagination session. Let's imagine that we're all underwater. That the water has reached the top of this building out of the San Francisco Bay. And what if we left it there for over 1,000 years? Well, that's the same question we asked ourselves 5 years ago at Guerrilla, when we started with the concept team on Horizon Forbidden West. What would San Francisco look like 1,000 years from now if it had been flooded all that time? To answer that question, we started looking at studies that showed how the water would flood parts of San Francisco as the ocean started rising. And what would happen if it would keep rising? San Francisco would turn into a group of islands surrounded by the tops of buildings still poking out of the sea. And I'm calling them buildings, but over time, these concrete floors in these buildings would have collapsed. Soil would have built up on top, allowing plants and trees to get a foothold, eventually creating pillars of vertical jungle. But close to the water surface, where the waves hit, buildings would be reduced to their mere skeletons. And even further down, below the ocean level, corals would start building on top of these ruins. Building interiors would start looking like underwater caves, with ocean tides slowly eroding the sharp edges into round corners, and stalactites starting to form at the ceilings of these lobbies like the one we have out here. We also explored what the underwater landscape of San Francisco could look like, how the remnants of the city could hold up underwater after all this time. Like this iconic landmark, the Palace of Fine Arts, which would largely be standing due to the use of natural rock and marble, which it's made out of. Whereas the ferry building would have a much harder time. Only the outer wall is made out of stone. All of its metal interiors would deteriorate and collapse after a couple of hundred years underwater. As for above the water, buildings would also collapse. The buildings that have been built with exterior metal structures like this one would topple over, and sand would start to accumulate on the shores of the new shoreline of San Francisco, covering what once were busy streets with a thick layer of pearl white sand. And although I personally wouldn't mind having a GDC in a setting like this, we didn't design it for this reason. I wanted to show you this version of San Francisco as an example of what the world of Horizon looks like, as it sets a stage for the different cultures that live in the world of Horizon. Which brings me to the topic of this presentation. Today I'd like to take you on a tour past two of the key settlements from Horizon Forbidden West, and share with you the design processes we used when visualizing these settlements. How we use the world of Horizon itself to shape the design of these locations and its inhabitants. But let me first talk a bit about myself. I started at Guerrilla way back in 2002. After graduating as an industrial designer. And for the past 5 years, I had the pleasure of working on Horizon Forbidden West, the sequel to Horizon Zero Dawn. And just out of curiosity, I know the game has only been out for a month. How many of you have already played it? Well, And how many of you have already met the Tenakt and the Utaru? Wow, okay. Now, for those of you who haven't played the game, let me explain briefly what Horizon is about before we look at these settlements in more detail. I'll try to do this as short as possible to avoid any of the spoilers. So Horizon Zero Dawn is set in a post-apocalyptic world where nature has reclaimed the land, just like in the example of San Francisco. It's a world that for centuries was uninhabited by humans. And when they returned without the knowledge of their past. They were basically thrown back into a hunter-gathering society. This life was made intensely difficult by the presence of these giant robotic machines. These machines came in various shapes and sizes, but they had one thing in common. They were all extremely aggressive against humans. This made settling in this world a big challenge. Now let's look at one of these settlements in more detail. The Utaru one, with their main capital Plainsong. One of the key defining elements for the Utaru comes from the machines that roam the lands around them. Each culture in Horizon deals with the threat of these large machines in its own way. For most settlements, these machines are perceived as extremely dangerous wildlife. As a result, they fortify their settlements or place them out of reach of the dangerous ones. But for the Utaru, we wanted to try something different. We wanted to try a relationship with the machines where instead of hunting them, they could grow dependent on them. But how would you grow dependent on a large machine like that? Let me introduce the plowhorn. This is a machine that's designed to growing food. A large machine that uses its horns to fertilize ground and is planting crops with the use of those seed pouches you see on the right. It's basically a combine on 4 legs. These plow horns can turn deserts into grids in fields in a grid-like structure filled with edible crops. An ideal location for the Utaru to settle in, right in the middle of their own natural food supply. And besides food, they would also need resources to build their houses and clothing from. One naturally grown resource that they had an abundance of would be bamboo, which is a great lightweight construction material that we started exploring as using as a base material for their huts. With the bendable qualities of bamboo, we started exploring sort of base shapes as a basis to layer on top the different layers, the external parts of the hut. And for this, we took inspiration from a variety of weaving techniques from all over the world. One technique that we found very inspiring was the way that ikebana baskets are woven in Japan. Just like this one. These baskets make use of lacquered bamboo. Long strips that create beautiful patterns along the outside with long, elongated, curved lines all the way through. And we applied this principle on a larger scale to the entire hut. And we were very happy with the unique look that this was giving us. Long curved lines make the hut feel like it was grown instead of constructed. And with that idea, we created a variety of these huts, sort of like giant baskets for people to live in. While retaining that feel of grown instead of constructed, we started to look at different weaving patterns, each unique and distinctive in its own way. And we felt that we were hitting on a very ownable and distinctive look for the Utaru. A downside of this type of weaving is that it's not as protective against the rain, but it does give really nice, allows for light to play at night through the holes in the weaves. And not just the holes, also the bent surfaces play really well with the lights of the Otaru. As for where to place these huts, we used the ancient ruins of a satellite array that was built when the landscape was still a desert, providing a safe place for the Otaru and adding even more to the unique feel of the settlement. We started to block out their entire settlement on top of a 3D representation of these dishes, designing a purpose for each and every dish, like the one on the right, which was made for cooking and storing food. The one in the center, closer to the ground, was their housing unit, housing dish, where we designed these support structures to connect the different huts together and create paths through the entire settlement. Again, resonating those long, flowy lines that we were inspired by the ikebana baskets. And those pathways eventually ended up on bridges like this one that connected different satellite dishes. And just like their houses, these bridges were designed to look like they've been grown rather than constructed, to underline the connection of the Otaru that they have with nature. One of their dishes even still had a giant tree in that had grown there before. And the Otaru hadn't removed it, but embraced it and created a hanging garden around it, where they grow their own plants that they can't find close to their settlement. And using these bamboo techniques, we expanded on not just creating their houses and their environment, but also their props. These decoration items and the two lights on the right that have this nice translucent sheen. Besides these lights, we also looked at tools to gather crops from the fields that are surrounding their settlement. And again, using bamboo to weave robot parts into handles. Extending this thought onto even their clothing, we experimented with creating hats out of woven patterns and even sandals, which works fine for these sort of stiffer elements that people wear, but it's kind of hard when you're doing the actual wardrobe. To create bamboo that create clothing pieces that look comfortable to wear, made out of bamboo. By combining leaves and machine cables from robots, we designed these togas that wrap around in a single piece. Again, creating those longer curves that wrap around the body, avoiding symmetry and straight parallel lines, with curved belts and a tear shape around their neck. And at the center of that tear shape, a decorated seat pouch to show their appreciation of the plow horn. And as an act of courage, it's not only the plow horns that affected the look of the Otaru. To show their appreciation for these plow horns, they went into the field and as an act of courage, put their hands on these plow horns with colored paint. So if you walk around the horizon and you see a plow horn with colored paint on it, that's because the Otaru appreciate them so much. This takes me to the second settlement I'd like to show you, which is the Desert Tunax, main capital, Scalding Spear. For the Desert Tunax, their origin story is almost the polar opposite. They live in a land with hardly any resources, and they had a hard time coming by, which made them focus on a more combatant lifestyle, fighting the surrounding settlements as well as the robots. split off into 3 clans. They have their origins not with the machines, but in the ruins that they had discovered. The key defining element for the Tenakt is a ruin from the old world, a military memorial that the Tenakt had discovered. A memorial that was built 1,000 years ago, before the Tenakt had found it, to honor a military unit that had battled against automated war machines. These great warriors from the past became a key inspiration for the Tenakt. But for the Tenakt, the only version of these great warriors that they actually saw was distorted and mangled. Corrupted data and degraded projection had warped the holographic images over time. So we, as a concept team, started exploring how far we could take this broken projection idea. How could we shape these patterns? And initially playing with different color distortion and pulling at the different angles, we still felt that this was too close to the original image of a soldier. So we took that even a step further and, almost like looking through a disoriented piece of glass, started warping these warriors into these extended figures, distorting their shapes even more, which created an interesting and unique silhouette for these warriors. From that, we took a color palette and a pattern style for each and every one of the different Tenakt tribes. The Tenakt are divided into 3, depending on the region that they live in. There's the desert, jungle, and mountain Tenakt, and they all reference a different group of military that they had seen in the museum. For the desert, it was the forward and aggressive operations, and we translated that into this outward motion and this aggression in that face that you see there. As for the jungle, they were more trappers, so their symbology became more inward, with pointy fangs pointed inward, whereas the mountain Tenakt had more of a hide and secure locations high up in the mountains, which we associated with this more inward and concrete shape language. And from this, for the desert Tenakt, we started exploring how this could look in motion, how we could angle up some of these patterns and distort them, combining different patterns, trying to look for that aggression that we felt was suiting for the desert Tenakt. And these are some of the early sketches that show a sort of an overlay of those patterns onto a character, trying to mimic the distorted holograms that they had seen in the museum, where color patterns were painted on and even additional rubble plates were added to suggest those distorted holograms. For us, this wasn't going far enough, so we created even bigger masks with stranger shapes and had the colors of these patterns tattooed all over their bodies, resulting in masks like this, built from robot parts, where they had edged off the different sides to create the angular pattern that you saw in those earlier studies. Adding all those plays onto these warriors made them look as intimidating as the one you see here. And again, for them, we also created the tool sets to allow them to make these things. This as far as the characters goes. What about their housing? Well, they're fierce warriors. They're not architects. So if you can't build yourself, why not use an existing ruin? We thought that would be an interesting base for them to start off. As they are in the desert, there's not a lot of architecture that you can lean into. So we felt that this solar power plant matched the view of the world that the Tenakt had. It would serve them as a nice fortress surrounded by these shields that looked like it was already protected, and a nice central tower that they could see the lands around them very well. So this was the base for their architecture and living, but they still had to put huts on top of that. And as I said, they're not that great builders. So we started as simple as we could, throwing together a bunch of beams like a game of Mikado and tying them together at each intersection. And then filling up the spaces in between the beams with floors and walls, allowing us to create these erratic shapes that also supported the erratic look that we had in the holograms, as well as these nice overhanging rooftops for some much appreciated shade in the desert. Going back and applying the color scheme of the desert Tenakt that you'd seen earlier, we finished them by painting them in their war colors. And arranged them around the central solar tower that you see here. By arranging them in this manner, this outward way, we started to create a silhouette that almost looked as aggressive as a silhouette and almost like an explosion frozen in time, which we felt was very appropriate for the aggressive desert Tenakt. As we were arranging this, we noticed that some of the concrete didn't fall in line with the Tenakt thinking of decoration, so we started chiseling into that, seeing if we could bring back some of the patterns also on their outside walls. And then again, using paint and simple wooden decorations to bring that in line with the holograms that they'd seen before. And at the center of this settlement, there's of course a combat ring, a combat arena where the Desert Tenakt train to become even better warriors. And overlooking this combat arena is their commander's hut, where he can oversee where the commander can oversee the progress of the Tenakt in the village town. We had people come in and question us when they were looking at this, saying, "Well, that's quite a reach, Roland. When you're having this entire culture based off a glitch, a misinterpretation of the past, isn't that stretching things a bit thin?" Funnily enough, this happens in our world as well, where we've interpreted old Roman sculptures to be white, and this white color has resonated in so many of the derivatives that we've created from that time. Things like even the White House might have had more color if we had found at an earlier stage that most of these Roman sculptures had actually been brightly colored instead of polished white to look better in the museum. I've been talking a bit too fast, but this already brings me to the end of my presentation on the two tribes in Horizon Forbidden West, Plainsong and Scalding Spare. And I know my jet lag has been killing most of this presentation, but I hope you have gotten a bit of an insight of the way that we work at Guerrilla. Some of the decisions that we've made along the way, and how most of our design choices have been made not because we think it looks cool, but because we sort of go out into the world of Horizon and discover as much as we can, driving the visual choices that we make at the concept team. Thank you very much for listening to me being very nervous, and that concludes my presentation. Are there any questions? No, I'm sorry, there.
Hello there.
Hi.
As we've just seen, that can get really, really detailed. How do you know when you've reached a point of like, this tribe is detailed enough, we have 8 other tribes to look at? Because it's very impressive how far in the detail you've gone.
Yes. Often when we think we've gone far enough, we get replies that we haven't gone far enough yet. Because once you start modeling these things, and it's easier when you're doing things that are based on reality, but if you're designing your own things, you need that amount of detail to actually show in the models that end up in the game. So oftentimes I think, wow, we've done a really great job. Here's the Utaro package. They come back and say, wow, all this weaving, how does that work? Which material is what? So we go back and look at it again. So by the time that that is quiet, we know that we have done our jobs.
Gotcha, thank you.
Yes.
Dude, I love the game. Amazing art direction, especially shipping on PS4, PS4 Pro, and the PS5 must have not been easy. In the art direction, what was the hardest thing that y'all face? Because like any other generation, cross-platform, like what was the hardest thing y'all did?
Thank God that wasn't a worry on my discipline. We designed things to maximum resolution or maximum amount of detail, so that we were always able to answer any questions with regards to what material, how things look at a not a microscopic level, but quite a detailed level. Yes. So I think this is not a question for me. It hasn't made it any harder for our team.
Hi there. Oh. Hi there. Amazing talk. I really loved seeing the amount of concept art throughout the talk and just how creative it all was, which I guess was what the talk was about. I come from indie, and in the world of indie, you have a lot less resources for stuff like having concept art for everything. Mm-hmm. So in my experience, we just end up like making stuff on the fly that might not necessarily have a concept ready for it. So I'm wondering, in your world, how much of this, does everything get a concept, everything that gets made, or are the concepts more to guide like maybe one version of something and then the modeler expands from there?
That's a very good question. Although we do a lot of concept art, we don't concept art the complete world. Okay. So we create style guides for each of the different tribes, and those usually have a showcase of a main settlement and what that could look like I've shown you today. But there are many derivatives of that, where we try to include as much information in the style guide, sometimes not just technical about how a layout would look, but also how some of the people would act, how they greet each other and things like that, to inform anyone working on this how to best construct or build derivative settlements.
I see. So there's kind of a trust moving forward to the
There's definitely trust moving
next
forward.
levels
Yes.
in the pipeline. Okay.
Yes, yes. It's too big a world to completely sketch out at that level of detail.
I see. Thank you.
Yeah.
One more question.
I'm going to take it.
Did you also heard that, right?
Thank you. I really love the designs you've got, and especially the research that goes into San Francisco and building in that water level. And I'm just curious how much of the concept and designs come from a game design standpoint as well, with having kind of the flooded sections and how that leads into gameplay. How much of that falls back onto you as well?
So the question is if how much of the gameplay is involved at an early stage when we're designing these things.
Yeah.
That happened quite early on. Our initial, we had taken lessons from our previous game, Horizon Zero Dawn, where some of these larger cities had less activities, to allow this time to create spaces that were game design friendly as well. So in conjunction with game design, we looked at the different spaces and where to open up and where certain opportunities for certain types of gameplay would work really well.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you. Sorry, wait, 1 second. I don't want to take all the applause. There's been a lot of concept artists creating this work inside and outside our company, so please applaud one round for all of those artists creating those images. Thank you.